Good morning or afternoon, as the case may be, and welcome to the Financial Security for All webinar this month. We are so happy to have Jenny Abel and Sarah Ritchie with us to talk about planning ahead. And so that's kind of planning ahead for some of those life changes that may come unexpectedly at the end of life or even as the result of a crisis. So we're going to be talking about some estate planning and advance directives and some of those end-of-life decisions. Jenny and Sarah are from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension in Human Development and Relationships Institute. Jenny has been there since October of 2019, and prior to that, she worked for more than 18 years in the Arlington office of the Virginia Cooperative Extension Service, leading finance, nutrition, and energy conservation programs. And Sarah has been with Extension for more than 7 years, and in her program manager role for the last 3 years, her program areas of focus include family caregiving, increasing social connections, end-of-life planning, and creating aging-friendly communities. Please join me in welcoming Jenny and Sarah.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So, Laura, thank you so much for that great introduction. And as Laura mentioned, we're going to be sharing this brand new curriculum that we just launched this spring. So it's very, very new, called Planning Ahead, where AHEAD stands for Advanced Directives, Handling Financial Changes, Estate Planning, and Arriving at Decisions for the End of This Life. So it's a very long spell out of the acronyms. You can see why we put it into acronym form. We're going to be referring frequently to an 83-page workbook that we created to go along with this curriculum. So I'm going to put the link to that in the chat so that you can access it and download it and refer to it as we're going through the various modules so that you can see the worksheets and handouts that come as part of that as we're talking about them. So planning ahead, as Laura mentioned, is a program that seeks to help folks plan for the changes and things and issues that come up at the end of life. And we've tried to make this very comprehensive. So those of you who have been in Extension for a while know that there are some great resources out already. I'm thinking of Who Gets Grandma's Yellow Pie Plate from University of Minnesota. There are other estate planning resources around the country. We wanted to put together something that really encompassed lots of things and lots of issues that people might need to consider as they're nearing the end of life. So thinking about healthcare needs, hospice versus palliative care, planning for funerals, planning for how people want their remains taken care of, planning for the disposition of personal property, also thinking about the financial changes that come up, talking about those advanced medical and legal directives. And also we wanted to encompass the emotional ramifications that come as part of all of this and think about how does someone who loses a loved one deal with all these changes while also being able to process their own grief that they're experiencing. And so that's why the 7th module in this series talks about understanding grief and dealing with that. So we involved a pretty large team of our educators in creating this program. And as you'll see when we go through this, it was a pretty lengthy process in creating all of these resources. So before we dive into how we came to where we are today and how we created this tool, but think about this: when you think about your own eventual death, What's the most important thing that you would like to do to ease the transition for your loved ones? I see that Jessie entered be specific with my desires. Yeah, absolutely. Clean out my basement. Yeah, yep. I just moved my mom into senior housing, so I can really relate to that, Rebecca, because it took us quite a while to clean out her house. Yeah, take care of as many details as possible, put things in writing and have them notarized. That's great. Thanks, Kamaya. Tori says to ease financial burdens, know who gets what. Yeah, that's, and again, thinking about those of us who are familiar with who gets grandma's yellow pie plate, I think there was just recently a session on that through this format on who gets grandma's yellow pie plate. That's something that program talks about a lot. So what does the research say about end-of-life planning? And I can share the sources that we got these from. I've got that in the slide notes. So not too surprisingly, the majority of folks think that it's important to talk about end-of-life wishes. 92% of people think it's important. But research has found that only 32% of people have actually done that. 41% of people have set aside money to take care of long-term care needs. 40% have signed a healthcare power of attorney. So that means 60% of folks have not done that. And the research that we found says that end-of-life planning is associated with improved well-being, improved emotional and psychological well-being. So, you know, we've shown that this is something that people say they want to do, but for a variety of reasons, they haven't done it, haven't had the time to get to it. And oftentimes it can be difficult starting these conversations with loved ones. I just want to refer back to the chat. So we have another comment that makes sure people can find what is needed to access all important papers. Yes, and as you'll see as we go through that was a huge motivation for us in creating these resources and specifically in creating that workbook. So what were our motivations for creating this program? So we had a number of motivations. The two principal ones were that, like Jessie said in the chat, that individuals want to make sure that their wishes are known and respected, and that things happen according to how we want them to when we near the end of our lives. We also wanted to ease transitions for family members when they lose a loved one, because so often if a loved one dies and things aren't in order and loved ones, those who are left behind, don't know where to find account information or information about wills or trusts or other pieces, then they're not afforded the opportunity to process their grief because they're struggling and having to deal with all of these pieces. And they're having to scramble to find all these documents and try to figure out what's going on, and they don't have the opportunity to process their loss. And I'm going to share a personal story that was a big motivation for me in creating this tool and this toolkit and this curriculum. So in 2017, my father was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer, and he passed away in September of 2019. So we were fortunate in one respect in that we had time to prepare. We knew that we were going to lose him. We didn't know when, but we knew. And so it wasn't as if it was a sudden loss. And so we did take advantage of the fact that we knew that, and we did try to get a lot of things in order ahead of time. But when he passed, when I was helping my mom after his death, she and I found there were all sorts of things that we hadn't thought of. There were all kinds of things that came up that even though we had tried to plan, we were scrambling, and in the midst of of our grief and dealing with the loss of not having him in our lives anymore, we also had to scramble and try to figure out all of these pieces that we hadn't thought about. And we thought that we had done a good job in planning. And so a motivation for me in creating this was, I don't want other people to have to go through that. I want people to be able to have everything that they need in place so that they can have the space to process their grief and to ease the transition. Another motivation in this is, I'm sure that that like us, a lot of you periodically are asked to do situational analyses in your counties and in your states to kind of get the pulse of what's going on and what your localities are thinking about and looking for, and in order to prioritize programs. And we did our last one here in Wisconsin in 2018, which is actually before I moved here. But we have really great records of that. And one thing that we were finding that a lot of counties and municipalities were saying, you know, when people lose loved ones and spouses or partners are left behind, oftentimes those spouses or partners now have to handle the finances, and that's something that perhaps they didn't have to do before. And now all of a sudden they're having a transition and having to deal with that, where it's not something that they were used to doing. And so it's thrown people for a loop. And a lot of widows especially were seeking public benefits and seeking assistance from localities who didn't before. And so this was another prompt for creating this resource, was to ease the burden on localities that were seeing an increase in requests for assistance from widows and widowers. So, like I said earlier, this was quite a long process in creating this toolkit, and is one that I think we didn't expect that it would take this long, but in retrospect, we're really glad that we took the time. And then we were very fortunate to receive a small grant of $4,000 from a local foundation through the university that allowed us to do a year of pilot testing and to hold focus groups and to pay for incentives for people who participated in those focus groups. And so we did 6 pilot courses around the state. We held 4 focus groups. We also did follow-up phone calls with many of the participants in addition to doing those focus groups. And those phone calls often targeted folks who couldn't attend the focus groups. We also have this unique program at UW-Madison that's through our Wisconsin Network for Research Support called CARDS. And CARDS stands for Community Advisors on Research, Design, and Strategies. And this is a group of community of key informants from who are currently mostly African-American older adults, and they are asked to provide feedback. So we had the chance to meet with them and share our tools, share what we have developed, and to get their feedback. And they gave us lots of excellent comments on changes that we should make, additional resources that we should add, and things that would make this toolkit more useful. We also received input from Hmong community members, and later on in this presentation, Sarah's going to talk more about what we're doing with that feedback. We held a training for facilitators this spring, and then officially launched this curriculum and are starting to hold courses around the state. So these are some of the things that folks in the focus groups and through evaluations and surveys told us when we were in our pilot testing phase. And this feedback was so valuable and allowed us to add lots of additional resources and make changes to existing ones that we had developed. One of the big things that folks said is they wanted us to have right near the front a list of places to contact for mental health support. So we added a page, and if you've downloaded the workbook, you'll see that close to the front. We added a page on places that people can turn to for suicide prevention and for counseling and for that support, because a lot of the things that we're talking about are very sensitive and can bring up a lot of emotions. We also heard that people wanted to make sure that this wasn't targeted only to older adults, because we understand that everyone 18 and over can begin planning for these things, can start creating estate plans, and can start thinking about how they want their assets shared if they pass away, because unexpected things can come up at any point. It's also, we know, important for folks to have those powers of attorney into place, because you can become incapacitated or unable to make decisions for yourself at any age. And so it's important for people at any age to be thinking about having those things in place. We heard a lot about people talking about navigating housing transitions as they age. I just mentioned earlier that just a few weeks ago, I moved my mom from her house into a senior living community, and that obviously was a huge change for her and for our family. So that's another one that's, close and personal to me. We had created a glossary because we realized that so many of the things we were talking about in this curriculum might be unfamiliar to folks. But one thing that we heard from our participants was that they didn't understand the definitions that we used to explain these terms. So we did a major overhaul of the glossary to make the terms much easier to understand. We had included a form for a spending plan, as we do in most of our financial education curricula, right? I'm sure that you all have many versions of those that you use. But we heard from folks, okay, well, creating a spending plan is great, but we need a sort of side-by-side comparison that could help us think about what are we spending now and how's that going to change, and help us think through sort of our expenses in a certain area are going to increase, or are they going to decrease? And so we created a new form that allows folks to do that. Also, people were saying, I know it's really important to talk about this with my parents, or to talk about it with my kids, or to talk about it with other friends or family members, but I just don't know where to start because we've never talked about this as a family. So how do I do that? So we created a guide to help make starting those conversations easier. People wanted a place to take notes, so we added a page at the back to do that. There were a lot of comments about using plain language, and that gets back to those revisions that we made to the glossary. Also, people really wanted to know what happens to our various accounts when we die. Like, I own some savings bonds. What happens to those? What happens to my 403B or 401k? What happens to my IRA? What happens to my life insurance? What happens to other policies or plans or various things that I might have? So we made a very detailed handout that's in the Handling Financial Changes section of the workbook. Those are the green color-coded pages to address that. And so these are just some of the changes that we made thanks to the feedback that we got from the pilot test course. There were lots of other ones, but this is just a sample of what we did. All right, so I'm going to move into talking about the specific modules. So like we mentioned at the beginning, this curriculum features 7 different modules. And for each one, we have a PowerPoint presentation. There are embedded in the PowerPoints, we have lots of videos, and we've got the various sections in the workbook, which again, hopefully all of you have been able to access. And thanks, Sarah, for putting that link in again for those who maybe joined a little bit later. So yeah, that's great. So in our first module, Getting Started, this is a spot where we can kind of start thinking about the general approaches to the topic of end-of-life planning, and think about the documents and resources and information that we might want to pull together. So in the workbook, if you're looking at it, we start off this section with an end-of-life planning checklist, which is sort of a compilation of all of the things from across the 7 modules that throughout the course folks might want to think about pulling together. We also have that resources for support document that I mentioned in the last slide that we were prompted to add by our pilot course participants. And also that guide to starting the conversation, to thinking about how do we do that? How can we broach the subject in a way that's accessible and that our family members and other loved ones will be receptive, so that it doesn't feel scary or intrusive, but is a way to be thinking about, is a way to say, you know, I care about you, I care about our family, and these are things that are really important and that will make it easier as we go along. We also created this checklist that can be used following the death of a loved one. And that checklist suggests various tasks that need to be completed at various timelines. So there are some that are immediate. There are others that need to be completed in just a few days, and others that can be taken care of a little longer, a little farther along, like a week or 10 days later. So that checklist is divided up into those categories. We've also created a number of important documents here for starting to collect information that loved ones might need to access when someone dies. So there's a contacts list where folks can list all of the important people who would need to be contacted. So it could include attorneys or accountants, or if the person is still employed, names of employers. You'll notice also, if you're looking at the workbook, that another thing we added as part of that contacts list, and this was thanks to a suggestion from one of our pilot course participants, was a list where people could put contacts for groups that they're volunteering with, because perhaps they have an important role with an organization that they're volunteering with. Let's say they're the treasurer for a group that they're volunteering with, and if they die suddenly, other people in that organization need to know about that so that other folks can get access to the financial records and take care of things. So we thought that was a great suggestion and added that. We've also got this security codes and digital accounts, because in our electronic lives now, we have so many different usernames and passwords, and it's important to keep those in all in one place so that loved ones can easily access that. Now, of course, that's very, very sensitive information and needs to be kept secure. So you'll notice at the very beginning of the workbook, we start off with a sheet that provides recommendations on how to keep this information safe. You'll notice if you've downloaded the workbook that all of these forms are fillable. And so we have some suggestions for if you're going to keep these records electronically, how you can do that in a safe way. And also if you're going to print these out or have written copies of these, how to keep those safe. We also have a form for recording the locations of important documents. So this could be like your your will, or documents associated with ownership of assets like a house or a car, or investment accounts or bank accounts. So any sorts of those documents, we tried to think of ones, any sorts of documents that folks might have, and places to record where are those documents kept, so that it's easy for those who are left behind to find those documents and access them. And then, of course, there's our glossary that I've referred to a few times, and how we've tried to make that clear. So then the next module is handling financial changes. And I'd say these first two modules are kind of the most handout or worksheet intense of the 7 modules in this curriculum. So this one, again, there's quite a bit that we packed into this one. So we've got our financial services inventory. So this is where people can record all of the information about their banking accounts, their investment accounts, insurance policies, any sorts of financial services that loved ones might need to access upon their death. I mentioned the spending plan worksheet already, so we've got our requisite one there. That income and expenses planning worksheet, I mentioned that, how that was a resource that people asked us to add so that they can think about what their expenses are now and how those might change. And then we have quite a bit of information here on funeral costs and pricing checklist, and prepaying for your funeral. Because the Federal Trade Commission did a great job on creating these resources, we felt that we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. So we took what they had created and put that in here and gave them credit for that. So those are existing resources that we repurposed into this workbook. We also, like I said, during the pilot test phase, we got that signal loud and clear that people wanted information about thinking about those housing transitions. So we added a fact sheet about that. People also had a lot of questions about long-term care insurance. We added some information about that. And then that fact sheet that I mentioned earlier about what happens to our various accounts when we die. So we added 4 pages of information about that. So it's very detailed, so people get a good sense of what happens there. Transitioning to our third module, Advanced Medical and Legal Directives. So this is the one module I will say that if you want to take this workbook and use it in your own states, most of the information in here is not state specific, with the exception of this one. So for this module, we're using Wisconsin Advanced Medical and Legal Directive forms, and that's what we're referring to here. So if you're using this in your own state, you would probably want to contact your state Department of Human Services or the equivalent to access the forms for your state and insert those in here. So this is the one module in this where it does get pretty state specific. So in this module, we spend a lot of time explaining what is an advance directive for healthcare, what is a financial power of attorney, what's a living will. We even have a few other forms in Wisconsin, and so we go into those in quite a bit of detail. And in the workbook, we provide a checklist for making sure that people have considered all of the forms that they might need, and then we give people a place to access the Wisconsin forms. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Sarah, who is going to talk about the remaining modules in our book.
Thank you, Jenny. So our fourth module is on estate planning, and during this module, participants will understand the importance of pre-planning the distribution of property, the different documents that are available for estate planning, the roles a personal representative has and have a working knowledge of estate planning terms. So there are also several documents in our workbook. If you're following along, I believe that is on page, I think it's 58. So starting on page 58, if you're following along with the online version. And the first document we have here is estate planning throughout your life, which highlights different decades starting in the 20s and then through 60 and up. And it highlights different tasks that people should have completed within around that age. The next document is choosing personal representatives and power of attorney. And this document helps walk people through helps them think about who they should select as their personal representative. And the next document is a checklist for the different steps to making a will and what documents you'll need to get together to start prepare to put your will together if you haven't already started a will. And then the next document within the workbook is the distribution of tangible personal property. And this discusses what that means and how to think about that. And then along with that, the following document is a memorandum of distribution of tangible, oh, my mouth can't say these words together today, tangible personal property. And that's where you can list those items and sign and date it, and this can accompany your will. So it's like a document that goes along with your will. So by the end of this module, participants should be thinking about who they might select as a personal representative, where they should keep a list of their real and personal property, and they should review their beneficiaries on important financial documents. So it's sort of what is reviewed during the estate planning module. The next module is module 5, and that is on choices in end-of-life care. So after this session, participants will understand the role of palliative care and hospice, who they serve. They'll understand the role of end-of-life doulas and midwives, and become more comfortable with discussing end-of-life issues with their loved ones. We know that it's a topic that not many people feel comfortable with discussing. So in our workbook, there are 2 documents that accompany this module, a document on palliative care or hospice, and it compares the 2 side by side. And if you're following along, that starts on page 66. And so then a person can look through this and decide which one of these they might need or feel comfortable with. The next document is cultural and spiritual beliefs and practices about death, dying, and funerals. And this reviews different cultures or religions or ways of being and how they might see different practices for preparing for death, preparation of the body, and ceremonies or funerals. And at the end of this session, participants are given suggestions on what to think about before the next time. And they may select one of these areas for their action plan that they create at the end of the series. So thinking about who are 1 to 2 people they may want to have a conversation with about end-of-life wishes and writing down their names. And thinking about when they could have that conversation with the person they identified. So writing down that goal and writing that date on the calendar where they might invite that person to have a conversation with them about their choices in end-of-life care. And then reviewing the information about palliative care and hospice and which one of those options they might be open to if the need arises. Our module 6 is on final wishes. So during this module, we'll increase participants' knowledge on decision-making around end-of-life planning and memorial or funeral planning. After this session, participants will also understand the differences between traditional funerals, direct burial, and cremation, and understanding the definitions of advanced directives and living wills. And I believe we revisit advanced directives and wills throughout several of the modules. And during the session, we also briefly review Native American and Hmong practices, but it doesn't go into too much detail. So in the workbook, if you're following along, it starts on page 70, and we have 2 documents that accompany this module, which is the My Wishes questionnaire, which guides individuals through a series of questions to help guide their planning. And then there's the funeral planning checklist, which is fairly detailed. And we're finding culturally it might not be very relevant. So when we are possibly thinking about doing adaptations, we may be adding to this already very detailed list, but it does have a list of things, and the items that have an asterisk next to them are the items that are done so you can pre-plan for those. So those would be things like selecting a cemetery or a casket. So by the end of this session, participants can be thinking about whether or not they have an advance directive and if it needs to be updated or not. Participants are also, it's suggested that they think about 3 of these items that can be pre-planned for their funeral and writing those down and starting to work on that funeral planning for their final wishes. So our final and last module, it covers understanding grief. And after this module, participants will have an understanding of empathy and its importance during the grief process. They'll have a knowledge of the grief process and be able to identify their own coping mechanisms and how they've coped in the past. And they'll also be aware of what resources there are to support themselves and others as they grieve. This session can be a pretty heavy for some. So there is a slide during the presentation where the presenter will recognize that we all have experienced grief at one time or another, and that during the session, the group will hold space for others without judgment, trying to fix or change. So there are also a couple documents that go along with this in the workbook, and that is in what looks to me to be a very deep purple color. And that these documents start on page 77. There is no right or wrong way to grieve after a loss, and this document reviews what grief is, what types of reactions people might have while they're grieving, and how long grief can last. And then also there's a section on experiencing grief and how will I know when I'm done experiencing grief. And this is a National Hospice and Palliative Care organization handout. And so is the next handout on supporting someone who is grieving. So this document will help you if you are working with somebody or have a loved one that's going through the grieving process, and it provides you with some strategies to use when you're communicating with somebody who might be grieving. So after this module, participants are asked to start thinking about drawing on their strengths. There's an activity during the module where they can draw on some of their strengths when it comes to coping. And they might want to also think about their family origin, culture, or spiritual traditions and how those handle grief, and write them down if that might be helpful for them in the future. So during all of these modules, we ask people to think about action planning, because at the end of this session, we have our evaluation, because in Extension, we love to evaluate our programs. And right now we are evaluating the end of the full session. During our pilot period, we actually evaluated after each, we did more detailed evaluation on each module. And during our evaluation, participants are actually asked to think about planning in 3 months, like what types of these activities will they take part in for planning. So our post-evaluation was actually developed by our core team of educators that created the modules and our Extension evaluation specialist. The evaluations are distributed at the end of the full series using a Qualtrics link or a paper survey if the session is in person. And then the session or those paper copies are then put into our Qualtrics links so that we have all of our data in one place. So of course, we are interested in knowing whether or not the content provided to participants was enough for them to move forward with end of life planning, or if they needed more information. But we are also interested in, like I had mentioned before, knowing whether or not they plan to move forward and if they're going to take any action in the short term, at least, so in the next 3 months. So we do a 3-month follow-up for those that have indicated on the post-evaluation that they are interested in having a follow-up conversation, and they've also identified in their evaluation what they might work on. And actually we do, even though we just facilitated a facilitator training in April, we've had 2 sessions in our state already done by our extension educators, and we have some exciting evaluation results. Whoa, I'm going too fast. So our evaluation results have indicated that 100% of our participants in the first 2 sessions learned enough to move forward with the process of pre-planning. 88% of them were more confident in having conversations with loved ones related to end-of-life wishes. 94% know where to find reliable resources for more information on end-of-life planning. And 100% of our participants that responded to the survey didn't feel that they needed any more information to make them feel more confident in planning for themselves or for a loved one. And then with the question of in the next 3 months, what do you plan to do? Our top selections were plan to make their end-of-life wishes known, update their end-of-life plans, make a will or a trust, encourage someone else to do end-of-life planning, and set up advanced directives. So that is pretty exciting for our initial findings, which I think means that all of the time we put into this program, we did a good job. So our next steps, we're going to continue to evaluate our program and follow up with participants after 3 months. So right now, because we have just done the training in April, we haven't had 3 months go by, so we haven't been able to follow up with any of those participants yet with their goals and action plan. But we do plan to continue that at least for the next year or so. And we are also currently working with the UW School of Nursing and a group of Hmong students to revise the curriculum to be culturally relevant and sensitive to our Hmong communities. I think as Jenny had mentioned, we had received some feedback early on during our pilot from some Hmong community members and professionals that we might not have hit the mark culturally with this one. So we want to make sure that we're able to have a curriculum that's relevant to them as well. So right now the students are in the process of presenting the material to their family and friends, and then they'll conduct interviews and focus groups to collect feedback. Then our team will be compiling the data over the course of the summer, and we should have a document with all the revisions ready for the next stage of the project by the end of the summer. So once the revisions to the curriculum are complete, a select number of the students will share back our final materials with the individuals that provided the feedback. And this project will wrap up in September of 2023. We did receive some internal funding, the Wisconsin Collaboration Grant, to work with the School of Nursing on this project. And then finally, our extension team will be starting a community of practice for our trained facilitators this fall. In this space, facilitators can share what's working, what's not working, troubleshoot some issues, and even coordinate joint facilitation with each other. Since COVID happened, a lot of our programs are still being done virtually, and we've been able to collaborate with each other across the state for that co-facilitation, which is pretty exciting too, because we're even reaching some new audiences that way.
Thanks, Sarah. And we have one more question in the chat. So
sure.
If you're following the chat, they've been asking about time to present, hour and a half per module.
Oh, sure.
And Zoom, it looks like that you've done these Zoom. And let's see. Oh, typical audience size.
You know, I think people probably have anywhere from 10 to 20. Would that be accurate, Jenny? I feel like that's about the number of people we've seen in these groups so far.
And then what time of day have the sessions been offered?
I think most of them, It varies.
Yeah, that has varied quite a bit. We've done some daytime sessions. We've done some evening programs because we've had a number of professionals who have wanted to take part in these and they can't do that during the workday. And so they've joined evening sessions. In terms of partners, one of our biggest partners is we have something here in Wisconsin called ADRCs, Aging Disability and Aging Disability Resource Centers. And there is one of those in each of our 72 counties. So that's a big source of partnerships for this. We also partner a lot with senior centers, libraries, community centers.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, today, and we'll see you next time.